Okay. All right. So we're live. Audra, thank you so much for joining us. We really have got an important topic here. We're midway through 2021 and I need to make sure we're getting our timeline set for the rest of the year because there's so many things that are happening. So we appreciate you joining. So feel free to introduce yourself. I'm going to
Mhm.
go off video so you don't have to just watch me staring at you through the present.
Okay. All right.
But
Hello,
I'll be here.
everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to be speaking on behalf of Troop and with Biggs. So, just a little bit about Troop. We are an HR consulting and outsourcing company based in Portland, Oregon. However, we have clients throughout the United States. My role at Troop is I'm the Vice President of Services, so I oversee our outsourcing and consulting service teams. And so also I wanted to let everyone know that we have submitted for HRCI and SHRM credits. So those will be sent out after the session today. So that's all been set up as well. We can also send the slides if that would be something that would interest you as well. So without further ado, we have a lot of ground to cover. Just gonna briefly go over the agenda here. So first we'll talk about bringing employees back to work. So I know this has been a struggle for a lot of employers out there, but I will speak to some best practices on bringing employees back to work. Also, we will talk about leveraging the benefits of remote work. So whether that be on a temporary basis or a permanent basis, we'll talk about some benefits for both the employer and the employee of remote work. Then we will discuss considerations for a hybrid. Perhaps you're an organization that maybe you have to have people on site because of course not all jobs are able to be done remotely. So we'll talk about some considerations for a hybrid workforce. And then finally, last but not least, we'll talk about the COVID-19 vaccine, which if you were in the last session, I'm sure that was a topic. But we'll discuss that as well as the accommodation process. And please feel free at any time to put any questions in the chat. And my colleague Tori will she'll kind of stop and she'll ask those questions as we go through the topics today. So don't be shy about your questions. All right. So bringing employees back to work. So many employers out there had to unfortunately lay employees off or perhaps separate employees just due to COVID and business demands and what was happening. And perhaps now is the time to be calling people back to work. This really takes as much planning and preparation as it did when you had to unfortunately lay those people off. So my first word of advice here is to just make sure that you're choosing the jobs to be recalled and not people. Because if you're choosing, picking and choosing people and not jobs, you could be faced with some discrimination issues, right? Maybe it's, a manager is calling back their favorite employee or whatever it may be. So it's really important to choose the jobs that need to be called back based on that business need. Also, you don't need to call everybody back all together all at once, right? It could be a gradual process. It doesn't have to be, all at once because that can be a big undertaking as well. Another word of caution is don't make any assumptions about people that might want to come back to work. Maybe they don't want to come back to work, or perhaps you think, gosh, Joe, I think he has an underlying health condition, so I don't think I should call him back. So just be objective when you're bringing people back. Again, choose those jobs and don't make those assumptions and don't choose the people. So big issue here, and I have heard this so much over the last few months, is addressing those who refuse to return to work. This is very challenging for employers, especially since we've right the economic stimulus that has gone out from the federal government, a few rounds of that. So employees are enjoying, the money there. There's also been subsidies for unemployment, right, and for COBRA. So they're getting this money and they're at home, and so some employees think, gosh, why do I need to return to work? So my first word of advice here is to inquire as to the why. What is the why behind why they are refusing to come to work? It could be fear of coming back to work. Perhaps they are, fearful of, contracting COVID-19 or exposing their family to that. It could be childcare considerations, that they don't have childcare for their kids, or their schools are closed, or whatever it may be. But really drilling down into the why behind why are they not refusing? Why are they refusing to return to work? So get that first. Secondly is once you have that and they're still refusing to return to work, it's really important to notify the unemployment office, the local unemployment office. And those are all state-run agencies, so whether it's an Oregon employee or Washington employee, to inform them that you recalled this employee and asked them to come back to work because you have work for them to do now, and the employee has refused to return. Generally, that will make an employee ineligible for unemployment if they actually refused to come back to work. So really, really important step there to let unemployment know. It's something that you're going to have to kind of do on your own and reach out on your own. And also, I think it's a really good idea to get this documented. So whether that just be an email to the employee, Joe, I am confirming that you are refusing to come to work as I, offered you your job back as to, this date, and just save that. And then that can be used as documentation as well for unemployment. And then, you'll have to follow your separation process. If the employee was maybe just temporarily laid off and they were still kind of an active status, make sure that you go through your separation process. So the separation letters, if you use those, COBRA notification, deactivating of systems and passwords, and all of that needs to be returning of equipment. That all needs to be just following your normal separation process. And then again, just thoroughly documenting, the whole process and keeping that in an employee's record as well. And then once, let's say you have employees who aren't returning to work, well, then now you're forced to go out and find new employees, right? And start recruiting to backfill those positions. And right now, I am telling you, the market is, it's really, really tough for employers to find good talent right now. We've seen candidates asking for, an astronomical amount of a, base wage, and I've seen sign-on bonuses for dishwashers. So it's the market out there is something that I actually haven't seen before. So some words of advice here are: number one, make sure that you have a dedicated recruiter or somebody who is really knowledgeable on your culture and your company, because for the most part, recruiting is a sales job, right? So they're trying to sell the position, they're trying to sell the company to those candidates. So really having somebody who is good at that, I think, is really important. Also, once you identify a good candidate, it's really important to act quickly right now. So, send them through the interview process, get them through the reference check process just as quickly as possible. Send them that offer letter. Once that offer letter is signed, generally there's going to be a bit of a lag time, right, before the employee starts work. And it's really important to keep a pulse on that candidate, that new employee, check in with them, build that relationship with them, be in communication with them, because we have seen during that lag time of when, they accepted an offer and when they actually start, that sometimes employees, will call up the employer the day before and say, sorry, I'm not going to start with you because I got another offer or a better offer, whatever that may be. But if you can really try to build that relationship with the employee or a new hire, I think that will go a long way into retaining them and actually getting them to start work. A couple other points to look at too is look at your engagement strategies and your retention strategies. Now might be the time to go back and look at those, and maybe it needs a revamp or a refresh, because of course, retaining your current employees will, be less, you'll have less recruiting to do, right? Cost savings, productivity, all of those things, time. So if you can retain your employees, that it will go a long way in terms of not having to recruit new employees, because then you have the training and all of those things and the cost and the time. And then finally, look, maybe it's time to look at your compensation structure, look at your compensation philosophy. Like I said earlier, we're seeing sign-on bonuses for dishwashers. We're seeing people asking for astronomical amounts of money that we haven't really seen before. So maybe it's time to look at that and do a refresh. Maybe if you have remote employees or people that are working, in all 50 states, that maybe you're starting to look at geographic differentials and things like that. So this might be a good time to look at your engagement and also your compensation philosophy and how you have your wages structured.
Audra, we did have one question come through.
Sure.
It's in regards to pay equity, and somebody's wondering if that becomes an issue when you're maybe having potential employees ask for higher salaries or larger sign-on bonuses.
My goodness, that's such an excellent question. And yes, this will affect pay equity, another challenge for employers right now. So, you know, you need to make sure, especially if you're in a state that has a pretty strict pay equity law. Washington has it very strict, so does Oregon, so does California. And so if you have, my best word of advice is you need to stick with your structure, your compensation structure, right? So if you have a range of pay, let's say it's like $20 to $25, and somebody in that job classification that you're trying to bring in is asking for like $27 an hour, it's going to be really hard to justify why you're making that exception unless they have, gosh, you know, 10, 20, 30 more years of experience than others within the job. But you have to base it on those, what they call bona fide factors, right? Education, experience, skills, effort, location. There's many others as well. So yes, I mean, I have talked to employers who have had to turn employees or candidates down because of the inequities it would cause internally. And that would just would make the employer have to go and adjust everybody else's salaries, where it gets to a point where it's way too high and they're not profitable and they just can't do it. So yes, make sure that you are looking at internal equity and so that you're in compliance with those pay equity laws. Good question. Thank you. Okay, we're switching gears here a bit and we'll talk about remote work. So I'm just going to go into some benefits for the company. So first of all is attracting and retaining top talent. So we have seen that really increased retention with employees who are working remotely, and also attracting talent. Right now you have such a wider net that you can cast, you know, that employees are not subject to one place where they have to live based on where they work. So really it's just widening your net to just much more available talent. Secondly is diversity. With that wider net, you're going to be able to access different geographic areas, different socioeconomic levels. So you will be able to definitely increase your diversity initiatives because you're not, you know, put in this little funnel where you're only recruiting, let's say, you know, in the Vancouver area or the Portland area. You're casting a wider net. And also, you know, you're not having to pay for those relocation costs either, you know, because people can work from anywhere, which leads me to my next point of cost savings. So on average, we have found that employers save about $11,000 per year per employee for those employees that are working remotely. And that cost saving comes from not having a workspace any longer, right? Employers aren't having to pay for those leases any longer, those very expensive leases any longer. We've seen some of the perks and the benefits costs go down, right? Because you're not providing coffee anymore, you're not providing lunches out anymore. And so it's really the cost savings has been significant for employers. Increased productivity. So there is a study out, I have my notes here. So 35 to 40% on average, remote workers are 35 to 40% more productive than their you know, on-site or office counterparts. And generally that's due to less distractions or interruptions. So we've seen that increased productivity. And I want to note too that remote work is not for everybody. Some people thrive in it, some people don't. And so again, it's not for everyone. And then engagement. So we've seen studies that show higher job performance, lower absenteeism, increased collaboration with remote work. So that's also you know, a company benefit and an employee benefit, which leads me to the employee benefit. So better work-life balance. So, you know, now employees are home, they have more time to spend with their family, to do, you know, to attend personal events, and, you know, they can kind of schedule their work around their life. Cost savings for employees too. So we've seen, you know, now they're not commuting to work any longer. There's less, you know, cost for gas. They aren't going out to lunch any longer. You know, they're not having to buy, you know, super nice clothing any longer. So there's a lot of good cost savings for employees. We found in a study, an employee saves anywhere from $2,000 to $7,000 a year by working remotely. And it also has to do with parking fees and things like that. So no commute, again, more time available, less gas charges, maintenance charges for your automobiles. This is a really funny story. So the other day, my husband said, gosh, when was the last time you had your oil changed? Because we work remotely. And I couldn't remember the last time I had my oil changed. And I went and looked at our records, and it was 2019. And he just couldn't believe it. But we don't drive. I mean, we really don't drive anymore. So there's really increased benefits there for employees that are working remotely. And then the environmental benefits. I mean, there's less gas, less pollution, but less traffic on the roads now. So just some more good benefits for employees. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, in general, the foundational elements that you'll want to consider if you are contemplating, having a permanent remote workforce. So first of all is this notion of having a culture of accountability and trust. So this is your absolute foundation for remote work. If you do not have a culture of trust and accountability, remote work is not going to be successful for your organization. And we have a lot of clients, especially when COVID-19 hit and everybody was forced to, not everybody, but most people were forced to work from home. We had so many clients that said, how can I let my employees work from home? I don't know what they're doing. How do I know what they're doing? How do I know that they're not just, watching Netflix all day or whatever it may be? So that's because that culture of trust and accountability was not there. It was not in your foundation. And so that is an absolute must-have before you can even, start that remote work to be successful. Do you have the proper technology and tools in place? Do employees know how to access their files? Are they able to, is there software in place so they can do video conferencing, or do they have access to a computer? And so there's so many different technology things that need to be set up, and employees need to know how to use that technology, right, and be trained and to use that technology. Clear and communicated remote work policies. Remote work is very, very different than working on site, right? And so your policies in your handbook is likely going to need to have a complete revamp, because the remote work expectations are very different than working on site. And I'm going to get into the specifics about what we feel are the considerations to be within those remote work policies. So we'll dive into that here in a bit. But it's important to have those. Also really important to make sure your employees are signing acknowledgements for those policies and that they are kept in their employee files. Productivity and project management systems. So this is something that I think is really a good idea for remote work employers out there to have in place. And this just creates visibility for managers and for employees, whether that be, everybody has access to everyone's calendar, so they know when can they schedule meetings, when do they know, if somebody's busy or on PTO. But also there are systems out there and software out there where you can track, what an employee is working on, how much time it's going to take them to complete that task, what's the due date. So it really helps the employee stay focused and stay on track, and it helps the manager too. So they have that visibility as to, okay, I know what they're working on. I know they're really busy today or this week, or gosh, I think they need a little bit more work to do. So I'm going to, call a meeting with them and we're going to talk about a new project. So lots of good software systems out there to monitor that. And then security. So security is a whole nother topic that, we could talk about that for hours, but in general, you want to make sure, number one, that your remote work employees have a secure internet site, right? That they are connected to secure internet. Are you going to allow your employees to, work from a coffee shop or work from Starbucks where maybe there isn't a secure internet connection? And so security is really, really important. So working with your IT professionals or your outsourced IT to ensure that proper security is set up, and that should also be in your policy as well, so employees are aware of that. Another thing with security and confidentiality is, security of documents, right? So let's say you have an employee who is working at, Starbucks, and they have some confidential document up on their screen. Well, anybody can walk by them or look over their shoulder and see whatever that confidential document is. And so a lot of risks there. So just ensure your employees are, trained and they understand what's confidential, what's not. Another thing to keep in mind is printing, right? So if you have employees who are working from home now or working remotely, and they're printing out documents, well, what happens to those documents when they're no longer needed? Do you shred the documents? How do you know that they're shredded? We do have some clients out there that have actually said, we're not allowing printing. Like, printing is in our policy. We have a no printing policy. So that's another option as well. But of course, on the flip side, you have to make sure that you have the technology and tools in place to store those confidential documents. So a lot about security. Again, I'm not an IT professional, but just making sure that you're working with your IT folks to ensure that you have proper security set up.
I had one more question come through, Audra, but this one's more related to the previous slide on costs and benefits of remote work. So this specific question was asking about maybe creative ideas for remote workers, and they give an example of internet stipends, and maybe if there's other creative ideas you could give to these employees.
Very good question. So stipends are a fantastic idea, and we have seen a lot of employers out there who are implementing these stipends. A lot of them are just called remote work stipends, and that where they're just giving a flat amount of $300, $400, $500 a year, where employees can use that stipend for any sort of remote work purposes. It could be internet, it could be they want an ergonomic chair, they want an ergonomic desk. Gosh, they just want some nice pictures to put in their home office. So really, and that should be also, again, in your policy, but I think stipends are a great idea. Keep in mind, this is a compliance topic, but keep in mind, there are some states that do require employers to reimburse their employees for work-related expenses. The two off the top of my head are California and Illinois. So they say, California says, you have to reimburse for some reasonable percentage of the cost. So let's say internet is a great example, or a cell phone, right? If you're requiring your employees to use their own personal home internet or their own cell phone, then you need to reimburse them for some reasonable percentage. I know that's really vague, but my best advice is just to talk with that employee and say, gosh, what do you think is the average percentage that you use your home internet for work? 50%, let's say. Okay, well then they need to present their bill to you, and then for reimbursement. So just keep in mind, if you do have employees working in California or Illinois, that you're reimbursing for their business expenses. Great question. Okay, so I'm gonna switch gears here to hybrid. So as I said earlier, not all work can be performed remotely. Or perhaps you just want to have a bit more collaboration with your teams. So just a few options to consider. You could have an option to where some positions are to be remote and some need to be on site. And again, choosing those positions and not people is very important. So you want to base it on business need, right? So let's say that you have some jobs that they can only be performed on site. So those positions would come into the office or be on site somewhere. But if you have other positions that can be done fully remotely, and you have a business case for that, then that's fine. Then you can draw the line there. Just make sure things are documented. Make sure you have proper job descriptions in place so that if there was some issue or discrimination issue, you could say, well, this is why this job can be done remotely. This is why this job cannot be done remotely. Another option is maybe you say, okay, well, everybody's working remotely, but once a month or once a week or whatever it may be, we're going to have everybody in the office. So for example, every Wednesday, we want everyone to be in the office. We're going to have our all team meeting, our huddles. We're going to have our collaboration time together. So, you could have an option of where, it's all remote, but then there are some specific days that people work on site. Either that's, monthly or weekly or whatever it may be. And then compensation and benefits, this goes back to a bit about the pay equity too, is that if you do have employees who are working remotely and perhaps are different geographic areas, you may need to look at your compensation plan to apply any sort of geographic differentials, but always making sure that you're keeping that internal equity as well. And then the benefit piece of it is just ensuring that if you do have remote workers and they're working all over, all 50 states, that you have your benefit plan set up to where employees have access to providers, right? And those networks are set up. Because you might have people who are working, in a remote area or a rural area and maybe don't have access to providers. So it's important to, working with your broker to make sure that those proper plans and networks are set up and available for your employees. Okay. Moving into compliance. So this really applies to both if you're bringing people back to work and they're working on site, or if they're working off site, or if they're working remotely, or you're doing a hybrid. Just keep in mind, these are not all the compliance considerations, but in general, these are the basics. So always make sure that you are following the OSHA regulations, the CDC regulations, and all the safety precautions, because COVID-19 is still here. I know that a lot of people have been vaccinated, but it is still here. Some people may choose not to receive the vaccine. We'll get to that here in a bit. But just making sure that you're following those. Oregon OSHA has some very, very strict requirements for on-site and in-person work. There are training requirements, there are policy requirements, there are posting requirements. There are a lot of requirements for Oregon. And at this point, it's permanent. So they have said, Oregon OSHA has said, they may lift it if they see the pandemic go away. But at this point right now, it's permanent. So that's the masks and all of those things. So if you are bringing people back, just making sure you're following that, which does conflict a bit with the newly released CDC guidelines. But again, these are state laws. So if you're in Oregon or in Washington, making sure you're following your local OSHA laws. Your policies, very, very important to make sure your policies are in place. Not only, especially if you have employees working in multiple states. It's a really good time right now to look at your policies, make sure they're in compliance. If you have employees in California, especially, there are a lot of required policies that you wouldn't really think about having if you had employees just in Washington, right? But now if they're working in California or in New York or some of those East Coast states, laws are very, very different. So just making sure that those policies are up to date and in compliance. Accommodations. So, if you decide to have some sort of hybrid workforce, or gosh, maybe there are some employees who, and we'll talk about accommodations in a bit, but let's say that they are a high risk individual and, they can't be around people for a certain amount of time. You might want to look at, staggering shifts, doing job rotations. There's lots of different things that you can do in terms of providing accommodations to employees. Alternate work days, work shifts. So just a lot of things to keep in mind there. Just making sure, and this is just really applies to anybody who has a medical related disability to go through that accommodation process. Wage and hour. This applies to your hourly non-exempt employees. And this has really caught some employers off guard, especially with remote work, because employers can't physically see the person. How do they know that, that they're working? How do they know that they're clocking in and out? And when they're doing that, are they working? Are they not working? One of the biggest risk areas is having your hourly non-exempt employees work off the clock, which is pretty common when you're in a remote work environment. This just means if let's say somebody's boss emails them at 5:30, and they get off work at 5, that time and the person reads it, they respond to it, that time has got to be paid. So it's really important that your hourly employees know that they are to report any sort of time that they work off the clock to their manager or their payroll provider, however you're set up. I think a good policy to put in place would just be that our hourly non-exempt employees are not allowed to work off the clock, because it just creates so many issues for employers, and it can really cause some pretty hefty lawsuits. So I think it's best if you assign your exempt people, your exempt managers, to be available after hours if needed. Rested meal periods are also really important. Huge laws in Oregon, Washington, and California there. So making sure that your hourly employees know that they still have to take their breaks in meal periods, and that they're tracked as well. And then training and meeting time. So if there's a required training, a required meeting, that time has got to be paid for your hourly non-exempt employees. And then finally, employees working in other locations, we could do an entire webinar on this, but just making sure that your payroll tax is set up correctly, that you're set up in those proper states, because the tax laws are very different from state to state and by locality, even county and city tax. So it's important to know, and it should be in your policy too, that employees know where to go and they know who to notify if they move. Because if an employer doesn't know, it can really wreak havoc in terms of their taxes and their W-2s. You have to do a W-2C, and so really making sure that they know to report that if they do move, so you can make those changes. Also keep in mind that minimum wage is different in every state, and in some cities it's different as well. The minimum salary thresholds for your exempt employees, that's your executive, your administrative, your professional, your computer professionals. But there are some higher thresholds than the federal salary for exempt employees. Washington is definitely a state that has higher thresholds. So is California, so is New York. There are various other states. So just making sure that you're paying your employees who are exempt at that state threshold. There's also new hire notices that need to go out. There's different leave of absence laws. There's different sick time laws. So just making sure that you're kind of up to snuff on what those laws are in those states and applying that to your employees who are working in those areas. Okay, policy elements. So productivity. Do employees know what's expected of them? Do they, how is work going to be assigned? What are the deadlines? Just making sure that this is in your policy and clearly laid out for employees so they understand. Accountability. When will feedback be provided? When and on what timeline? Is it every day? Is it in a weekly one-on-one meeting? Is it, your annual performance review? We're seeing a lot of organizations move to a quarterly performance review instead of an annual, just because it's just more timely feedback for employees. And gosh, maybe it's time that you look at your performance management system, because if you have employees who are working remotely, you're probably not going to have a paper form and a manager sitting down with you completing that form. So this might be a really good time to look at your system and putting in more of technology around feedback and performance reviews. Availability and communication. Do employees know when they're supposed to log on for the day? Do they know when they're supposed to log off for the day? Are they able to take a lunch break? Or what is of course your non-exempt employees need to take a lunch break, but what is the expectation for that? Do they need to notify somebody when they're taking a break? What are the communication norms? Is it generally all video? Is it phone calls? Is it email? Is it, so there's just understanding those expectations and putting that in your policy so employees know what those norms are. I also want to point out when you're in the recruiting process, I think it's really, really important to let those candidates know ahead of time. We're a really video heavy company, for example, because a lot of employees who haven't, worked remotely on a consistent basis might not be used to that. That might be something maybe they're not comfortable with, or maybe they're just not comfortable with the technology. So really laying that out in that recruitment process, I think is helpful for the organization and for the employee. Workspace and equipment. Again, are you going to have that stipend? Are you going for employees to purchase equipment or things for their workspace? Just a quick note on workers' compensation. If employees are in the course of work and performing work, and gosh, they trip and fall over their laptop charger, that is likely going to be a compensable workers' comp claim. So just making sure that employees understand and that employers and HR departments know that just because you're working remotely doesn't mean that workers' comp doesn't apply, because it does. So just making sure that employees are set up for their with proper workspace that's safe and comfortable. The last thing that you want is some employee to be sitting on their couch, with their laptop, and they have a back injury, and then there's a workers' compensation claim. So just making sure that that's set up and also in your policy. Do they have the tools needed? Do they have, like I said, access to documents? Do they have access to files? Do they have what they need to get their job done? So explaining this in the policy, I also think is important. And then, of course, your federal, state, and local compliance. It may be that you, again, need to go through and just revamp your entire employee handbook. If you have multi-state employees, so employees working in multiple states, you could have just one handbook that covers all of those state laws. You could have addendums for each state or locality. Doing that method is going to be a bit complex, and it will be hard administratively to keep up with that, because you're applying different policies to different people. But it's something that you can absolutely do. And then security and technology. So making sure that your documents are secure, making sure that you have secure internet connections, that employees know about printing or not printing, or confidential documents. And so just making sure that that's laid out in the policy as well. And then dependent care. I mean, we've seen, some schools are open, but maybe they're open for a couple hours and that's it. Or gosh, schools will open and then they'll close for a couple of weeks because there was a COVID exposure, and then they're open again. And so are you an organization that's going to allow employees to have their kids at home while they're working? You could, but I think it's important that if you are going to allow that people know that, that they still have to get their work done, right? They still have to achieve their goals. They need to be productive. They need to be available for required meetings. So that's just something that the organization will have to decide as to if they're going to allow that or not. Okay, so I know we have just about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to move into employee well-being. And we have seen a lot about employee well-being in this past year, just because it's been tough. It's been tough for employers. It's been tough for employees, both, professionally and also personally, because people have just had a lot of ups and downs, a lot of personal issues. And so we're seeing a lot of employers take a shift from, their traditional engagement strategies and moving towards this culture of embracing employees' well-being, which includes their mental, their physical, and their social needs. Just making sure that those are being met. And we've seen when employees feel secure, they have trust, they feel comfortable at work, or they feel more cared for by their employer, that they're more likely to be a high performer. So that's, again, why we're seeing a lot of companies shift to this new model. But when an employee, when an employee's stress is reduced and they have a good work-life balance, they are less likely to have any sort of mental or physical type of health issues. So this is why we're seeing that this topic is really important, especially nowadays. There's also lots of data that supports this business case. We've seen higher productivity with employees that have a higher level of well-being. The quality of their work is better. Their experience with your customers or your clients are better because of their well-being. We've seen higher retention rates with employees that have a high level of well-being, and then less absenteeism because they're feeling good about where they are. And then just a note here that, and I'm sure many employers have already had to deal with this, but we've seen a lot of disabilities emerge from the pandemic. that will likely require an employer to go through the reasonable accommodation process, or the interactive process under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. We've seen PTSD, we've seen anxiety, depression. So there's a lot going on out there. So if an employee does come to you and says, I'm struggling, I've got anxiety, I have this or that, just making sure that you don't just dismiss it, that you take that seriously, and that you go through an accommodation process. And I'm going to talk about the accommodation process here in just a bit. Through all that, you're likely still going to have some employees who are struggling. And the reasons, there's many different reasons. I'll go through a few here with you now, but home distractions can cause employees to struggle, whether that's kids at home, their Wi-Fi is having issues, the delivery person's there, the dog is barking. It just causes people to not be able to focus for long periods of time. So we've seen a lot of this start and stop work. So they're working and then something happens, they have to go take care of it, and they go back. So they're not able to focus for long periods of time. So this can really decrease productivity. Lack of proper home setup. So if they have to work from the coffee table or from their couch, or it's not productive, and it's going to affect their well-being, and also, gosh, it may cause ergonomic issues and workers' comp issues. So just making sure that they are set up properly. Childcare considerations, again, many schools are out, or daycares are closed, or whatever it may be. So just keep in mind that there are some leave considerations for that. So in Oregon, under OFLA, Oregon Family Leave Act, this is a covered reason for leave, as long as the employee and the employer meet those eligibility requirements. So just keep in mind that that's something to consider if an employee is struggling. You could also offer them a personal leave if you have a personal leave policy. Washington paid family leave, this is not a covered reason under Washington paid family leave. So if you're an employer in Washington and want to offer leave for employees, it would have to be one of those personal leaves that are unprotected. Clear performance expectations and timelines. Does the employee know what the expectations are? Do they know what type of work they need to get done? Do they know when it's due? Do they know that their work maybe affects another team's work? So just making sure that they have those expectations in place. Next is just show empathy. I mean, like I said, people are struggling during this time. I think things are getting better now, but I mean, we've been through a pretty rough patch. But I think it's important for employers to just show empathy to these employees, but keeping in mind too that I call it the performance bar, right? You don't want to lower the performance bar because somebody is struggling. I mean, people need to be held accountable to performance standards. And even if somebody, is struggling, you don't say, oh, that's okay because they have distractions at home. I mean, that's not okay, because then you may run into some discrimination issues there. So showing that empathy, but then making sure that they know that what's expected of them, that, you've noticed that they're struggling, they're having distractions, but you still needed them to perform, to get their work done, to accomplish their goals. And then accountability. So instead of, telling the employee how to do the work, here's this assignment, here's this project, focus on those expectations. Here's what I expect the project to look like when it's completed. Come to me if you have questions. This is the due date. So I think it's important to just resist to tell employees you need to do it this way, A, B, C, D, E. I mean, employees can generally figure out how to do a task if you give them those expectations. And then finally, if it comes to a point where the employee just they're not performing, and they are still struggling even after your coaching and your discussions with them, it may be time to look at a performance improvement plan or a PIP. So you have that documentation, so the employee knows that they're put on notice and that they have the expectations that they need to improve, and that you have that documented. Especially in a remote work world, please, I stress, if you are going to go down this route, have a conversation with the employee first about the issues that they're having, and then document that in that performance improvement plan, and then go ahead and send them that document for signature. Please don't just fire off a performance improvement plan without having, any initial discussion with the employee, because it just sets a really negative tone. And the employee is shocked by it. So I think it's important just to make sure that you have that initial discussion with them first. Okay, my last topic here is the vaccine. So a lot of questions around, can we require the COVID-19 vaccine for people to be vaccinated in order for them to come back to work? The short answer is you can. Yes, you can, but be very, very cautious of this. And I'm not sure if this was covered in the last presentation, but I really stress to employers that you don't want to be the guinea pig or the first case law with this, because we're not quite sure. We have seen a few lawsuits already. I'm not sure exactly where they're at right now, but there have been some complaints from employees of employers who require the vaccine, and that the employee refused, and as a result, they were terminated. So my biggest advice here is to, just look at your business. Does it make sense for your business to require a COVID-19 vaccine? If you're a remote workforce and people are working from home or they're working remotely, it does not make business sense to require everybody to have a vaccine, because there's no interaction. And so that if you did do that, that may be grounds for some discrimination issues down the line. So I would suggest against doing that. Now, if you're an organization that, gosh, you're a construction company and you have employees who are constantly on the road, or they're in groups with interacting with people, that would make more of a business case. So again, just thinking about your business and what you do, and make sure that it makes sense before you just require people to just get a vaccine. And if you do require it, keep in mind that there are some employees who will likely refuse to receive the vaccine. And if that's the case, then you need to go down the accommodation path. And generally, the two reasons why an employee would qualify for an accommodation to not receive the vaccine are a medical disability or a religious accommodation. And I'm going to get my last slide here, we'll go through the steps of the accommodation, so we'll get through that. But if an employee refuses, again, ask the why behind why are they refusing, and then you may need to go down that path, because if you don't, you'll definitely end up with some retaliation or discrimination issues if you don't go through the accommodation process. And if you do require it, make sure you have a policy in place and make sure it's crystal clear and that people understand why they have to get the vaccine, when they have to get it, do they have to show their card, so on and so forth. So make sure that is in place. Also, there are some clients that I've worked with that have done kind of a recommended that they, it's their choice if they get the vaccine or not. For certain jobs that are maybe more interactive with people face to face, that maybe those jobs are required. So you could do some sort of a hybrid type of approach. Again, just make sure that policy is in place. You'll probably want to have it reviewed by your legal team. Again, because this is also new and we really don't want to see our employers out there to be that test case. So moving into, this is my last slide here, and then if anybody has questions, happy to answer. The accommodation process. So if an employee comes to you and says, I have this medical condition, and if I get this vaccine, it's going to cause some side effect. And so if that happens, the employee is essentially requesting an accommodation. They don't have to come out and say, I need a ADA accommodation, because most of the time employees don't even know what that means. So once you have that information, the obligation's on the employer to go through the process. So those are kind of the red flags. Also with, if somebody says, it's against my religion to get a vaccine, I don't get vaccines, that's another trigger to where you would need to say, okay, well, we need to go through this accommodation process. So if you have an employee who has a medical issue, it's really important, we feel, to get a medical certification to verify the need for that accommodation. This is very different than, not very different, but it is different than like an FMLA or an OFLA type of medical certification. This is very specific to the disability. Does it impact a major life function? There are forms out there that ask the medical provider for their ideas around what an accommodation would look like. Once you have that back, it's important to go through the interactive process with the employee. So talking to them about, what are their ideas? Because, we're requiring this COVID-19 vaccine, but what are your ideas, since you're saying that you aren't able to? For this case, it's going to be, they're just going to decline the vaccine. But what is the employer going to do to keep that employee safe? Because that's still an OSHA requirement. That's a federal law. Employers are required to keep employees safe or do everything they can to keep employees safe. So is it going to be, again, that job staggering, the shift changes? Is it going to be maybe they work remotely for part of the time? So going through that evaluation process, I want to stress too that if an employee says, I want to work from home full time, and that's not really feasible because of their job, you don't have to agree to that. You don't need to agree to their first request. So it's an interactive process. It's a back and forth. It's coming to a consensus. So just keep in mind that you don't have to just accept that initial demand. And then once you've agreed on an accommodation, just making sure that you follow up with the employee, document the agreed upon accommodation, put it in a letter to them. They can sign it, keep it in their employee file, then check in with them about how's it going, have things changed, and that type of thing. And this can also go on the flip side too, if you've had employees who have been working from home and because of, let's say, they're immune compromised or what have you, and their doctor has said, they need to work from home during the pandemic, but once they get the vaccine, they can come back to work. So we've seen it on the flip side too, where you provide those accommodations initially, and then when employees do receive the vaccine, they can come back to work. So that was a lot of information in a short period of time. But if anybody has any questions, happy to answer. You can also reach out to me. This is our main line and my extension there. And you can also email me if you have questions. I'd be happy to help you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Audra. We'll, I guess, just as a reminder, we're going to send out the recording to everybody, just so if you got some tips or just want to hear it again, we'll do that. So everyone's going to get a copy of that here shortly. I'd probably assume it by tomorrow morning, if that's okay. But thanks so much for going through this. I mean, it's great to hear these things and try to figure out that plan for the rest of this year. I think when you and I were talking about this, the idea was, what are we trying to project was going to happen? And I think we're kind of close to that, because we thought that maybe, there'd be less cases of the deal, but this whole opening up with the mass has definitely kind of pushed it along and made people have to consider what it's going to look like. So really appreciate the time. And Tori, thanks for being on there and answering questions too. So I think we'll probably wrap it up unless there's any other things you wanted to add to it at this point.
I don't think so. If anyone has questions, again, feel free to reach out. But thank you for having me today, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Yeah, and Audra, we'll put your contact information in that too. So thanks so much, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.